Joe Biden had reversed these policies, producing the largest illegal mass migration in history. In the last 27 months, they've deliberately admitted 2 million illegal aliens into our country, a population larger than the state of Nebraska. And while the Border Patrol was overwhelmed, another 1.5 million known gotaways have entered as well. That is an additional illegal population larger than the entire state of Hawaii. The Trump policy slowed encounters of unaccompanied children to 33,000, the lowest level in 8 years. In the last fiscal year, a record 152,000 came across. That's almost a 5-fold increase. Biden had exactly the same tools available to him as Trump, so it should be obvious that this is a deliberate policy that ignores not only the welfare of Americans, but that of the migrant children as well. On a border trip last year, I asked a CBP officer how to stop the trafficking of children into this country. His answer was immediate: get them safely home. He said the cartels charge thousands of dollars to traffic these children, and they don't give refunds. The moment children are returned home, their business will dry up. On another border trip, I was shocked to learn that no effort is made to get these children back to their homes, and very little effort is made vetting the so-called sponsors of these children, and very little interest is shown in following up on their welfare once they're abandoned to these so-called sponsors. So what happens to them? The administration's response is basically, don't know, don't care. But a recent New York Times investigation sheds some light on this question. After they get to the U.S., many are forced by their so-called sponsors into dangerous jobs with fake identity documents. Earlier this year, a sanitation company employing over 100 illegal alien children in jobs in slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants in the Midwest paid $1.5 million of civil penalties after a federal court found that these children were using caustic chemicals to clean razor-sharp saws and working overnight shifts. One of the great ironies of bill titles, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, makes this possible. While children from Mexico and Canada are immediately sent safely home, all others are admitted. That's a tremendous incentive to send unaccompanied children to the border. In 2014, even the Obama administration recognized the danger and asked Congress to provide it with, quote, additional authority to exercise discretion in processing the return and removal of unaccompanied minor children from non-contiguous countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, end quote. The House passed a bill to do just that, but Senate Democrats blocked it. The Trump administration was able to staunch the flow with new and strict requirements to ensure the safety of these children once placed with a sponsor, as well as Title 42 expulsion authority. But in 2021, the Biden administration dismantled Trump-era requirements to vet sponsors and perform background checks for individuals in the sponsor household, many of whom are involved in smuggling the children in the first place. And the Biden administration stopped subjecting them to Title 42. We now know that the administration has simply lost track of over 85,000 of these children. In September 2022, Axios reported that, quote, roughly 1 in 3 follow-up calls made to release migrant kids to their sponsors between January and May went unanswered. Don't know, don't care. According to the New York Times, the cabinet secretary responsible for these children, Javier Becerra, likened the sponsor placement process to an assembly line that wasn't moving fast enough. He complained, quote, if Henry Ford had seen this in his plant, he would never become rich and famous. This is not the way you do an assembly line. Last week, this committee approved a bill that would help stop this tragedy by returning these children safely home, as we already do for children coming from Mexico or Canada. No Democrats supported our bill. But I'm hopeful that after hearing the testimony of our witnesses, our colleagues will rethink their opposition to this long overdue reform. And although we're focusing today on young and vulnerable children, we should note that a large majority of so-called unaccompanied children are late teenagers or young men claiming to be minors. But that's a subject for another day. I'm now pleased to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since this is the first Immigration Subcommittee hearing of the 118th Congress, I just want to start by congratulating you on becoming chairman and also saying how honored I am to serve as ranking member. As the first South Asian American woman elected to the House, I came to this country by myself at the age of 16. It took me 17 years on an alphabet soup of visas to actually become a U.S. citizen. And prior to coming to Congress, I devoted a decade and a half to working on the issue of fair and humane immigration policy. So this is an issue that's both personal and collective for me. And I'm very proud to be the first immigrant to serve as either ranking or chair of this subcommittee. Looking forward to working with you and being in a position to help shape the debate of reforming our immigration system around the values of dignity, humanity, and respect. I also want to sincerely thank Representative Zoe Lofgren, who has for the last 15 years either chaired or been the ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee. She is a stellar champion for a working and humane immigration system, and I know she's going to continue to be an invaluable resource for this committee and for our whole Congress. Now to the work of the hearing. Unfortunately, between the hearings that we have held and the cruel, extreme, and unworkable immigration legislation that was marked up last week, this majority is once again showing that they are not serious about finding real solutions to fix our complex immigration system. This hearing is ostensibly about showing that the majority cares about the exploitation of children. But just last week, the same majority passed legislation out of this committee that would actually gut protections for unaccompanied children. That bill passed out of committee with not a single Democratic vote, and even Republican colleagues decrying the bill as extreme, un-American, and not ready for prime time. Specifically, that bill would allow unaccompanied children to languish in Border Patrol facilities for up to a month. It would force children to appear within 2 weeks before an immigration judge with no access to an attorney, and it would send children back to their home countries where they are at high risk for exploitation and abuse. The bill would decimate the Bipartisan Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which Congress passed on a sweeping bipartisan basis, and establish the U.S. government's central framework for keeping unaccompanied children out of the hands of trafficking. Democrats want to protect children, not make it even more difficult for them to be safe. And we've got more work to do, real serious work to make that happen. I was heartbroken reading the New York Times articles about young children who were being taken advantage of by unscrupulous sponsors and employers, and the potential warning signs that were missed. This increase in child labor is actually a trend that has been steadily on the rise, especially since 2018 under the former president, and it's completely unacceptable. That's why I was very pleased to see that the Office of Refugee Resettlement has announced an audit of their sponsor vetting process, and I look forward to seeing the results of that audit. I was also encouraged by the Department of Labor and Health and Human Services' recent announcement of a variety of new efforts to combat exploitative child labor, including a new interagency task force to improve coordination and information sharing among agencies. At the same time, we know that the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the administration overall need more resources to do more to ensure the safety of kids. And we in Congress have a responsibility to provide sufficient funding to those agencies to do this critical work. That includes funding to increase post-release services for children after they're placed with a sponsor, as well as increased appointment of counsel. Improvement in both of these areas will help protect children from mistreatment, exploitation, and trafficking. The Department of Labor also needs to be more aggressive in going after these unscrupulous employers to the fullest extent of the law. Many of these employers, by the way, were using E-Verify, which just goes to show how ineffective that system is, which was in the majority's bill last week, and they should be held accountable for hiring kids and subjecting them and all workers to harsh conditions. Every policy is about real human beings, and so I just want to close with a success story of an unaccompanied child who came to the United States a few years ago. 15-year-old Alejandra fled the gangs of El Salvador with her 10-year-old brother and sought safety here in the United States. Here, they reunited with their mother after being separated for 10 years. When she arrived in the United States, Alejandra did not speak English, she had problems understanding her teachers, and she debated dropping out of school. But she drew inspiration from her mother and from the support network around her, including the legal representation that she was fortunate to obtain, and she persevered. She ended up graduating high school as the salutatorian of her class and going to George Washington University on a full ride where she majored in biology. There are so many Alejandras out there waiting for Congress to help keep them safe and help them succeed by passing humane immigration laws. That's what we should be focused on today. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. The protection of children from exploitation, abuse, and trafficking should be a bipartisan issue. I hope my colleagues approach it that way today. I yield back.
Thank you. We have with us the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler, is recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, today's hearing would have been more appropriate to conduct last week, before the Republican majority marked up its extreme enforcement-only immigration legislation. And the majority's supposed concern for the exploited children that are the subject of today's hearing is hard to reconcile with a bill that would render unaccompanied children more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. That legislation would eliminate the right of many unaccompanied children at the border to seek protection in immigration court from human trafficking and other dangers, and to receive robust screenings by child welfare experts for evidence of mistreatment. That legislation would leave these unaccompanied children with the right merely to cursory screenings by law enforcement personnel lacking child welfare expertise, screenings that would largely fail to identify signs of trafficking and exploitation. This would lead to the summary return of too many children with valid protection claims to the same dangers they fled. Even more alarmingly, the Republicans' bill would subject unaccompanied children to detention in jail-like Customs and Border Protection facilities for up to 30 days, 10 times longer than what is permitted under current law. Unaccompanied children would undergo their first immigration court hearing within 14 days of their border screening. This would leave them with almost no time to obtain counsel, to understand their legal options, or in many cases to comprehend what a court hearing even is, much less to demonstrate their eligibility for legal protection from trafficking and other mistreatment. And as if that's not bad enough, their bill would prohibit Health and Human Services from funding counsel for unaccompanied children, stripping thousands of children of the lawyers they depend on to protect them from exploitation and other harm. As we pointed out last week, many of the components of the bill were not discussed in a hearing this Congress. That makes sense, given that we are 4 months in and this is the first hearing the Immigration Subcommittee has held. It's too bad, because if this subcommittee had met earlier, we could have also discussed the flaws of the E-Verify system. Some of the companies that employed and exploited the children were the subject of recent reporting used the E-Verify system to ensure that their employees are eligible to work. It clearly did not work correctly, or it was abused. It would have been helpful, before we marked up legislation that mandated nationwide E-Verify, to learn about these issues. We could have discussed how H.R. 2640 contains modest protections for authorized workers, but it assigns no penalties to employers who violate these protections under E-Verify, rendering these provisions practically meaningless. Yes, I think the committee would have learned a lot if it had actually held a hearing on this issue before marking up that cruel and extreme piece of legislation. At last week's markup, we heard a lot from our Republican colleagues about the so-called missing 85,000 kids as reported by the New York Times. Let's be clear, that headline was misleading when such allegations were made against the Office of Refugee Resettlement under the previous administration, and it is misleading today. We will discuss that issue in greater detail during the hearing. However, the New York Times reporting of children unlawfully working in factories, slaughterhouses, and other dangerous jobs is very concerning. ORR and the Department of Labor have taken some positive steps forward to address these issues. But make no mistake, more must be done. That will take significant resources devoted to both agencies. Agencies that would likely see draconian cuts if the Republicans are successful in their effort to hold our economy hostage to their extreme debt reduction demands while they threaten a catastrophic default on our nation's credit. As we consider federal efforts to address the exploitation of children, it is not helpful that in multiple Republican legislatures across the country, states are loosening their child labor laws to allow children to lawfully work in some of these dangerous occupations. The fact that Republicans are actively making it easier for young teenagers to work in assembly line plants, slaughterhouses, and night shifts in states like Iowa and Arkansas is appalling, and it only encourages the exploitation of these vulnerable children. It is hard to take seriously a a party that boasts of its concern for exploited children, while simultaneously stripping vital protections from unaccompanied children, promoting policies that would create the conditions for these children to be exploited, and then starving agencies of the resources necessary to protect them from exploitation. If Republicans want to engage in a serious effort to protect children, Democrats stand ready to work with you. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. And now we're very honored to have four witnesses with us today. Ms. Tara Lee Rodas is a federal employee with the Council of the Inspectors General for Integrity and Efficiency. She's speaking to us today in her personal capacity as a whistleblower who witnessed and reported the harm and danger to unaccompanied alien children while working as a volunteer with the Office of Refugee Resettlement in the Department of Health and Human Services. She worked at the Pomona Emergency Intake Site in California that housed and processed thousands of unaccompanied alien children arriving at the southwest border in 2021. Machina Rodriguez is the founder and president of the Alliance for a Safe Texas. She's a mother and former teacher who founded Alliance for a Safe Texas during the current border crisis. As part of her work, she's interviewed many women and children who have crossed our southwest border and has testified before the Texas State Legislature regarding the impacts of the border crisis. Ms. Jessica Vaughn is the Director of Policy Studies for the Center for Immigration Studies, a Washington, D.C.-based research institute that examines the impact of immigration on American society. Her area of expertise is immigration policy and operations, covering topics such as unaccompanied alien children, visa programs, immigration benefits, and immigration enforcement. And finally, Mr. Robert Carey served as the Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services under the Obama administration. Prior to his service at ORR, he served as Vice President of Resettlement and Migration Policy at the International Rescue Committee. Mr. Carey has served as Chair of the Refugee Council of the United States of America. I want to welcome all of our witnesses and thank them for appearing. We'll begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Great, thank you very much. So let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Please know that your written testimony will be entered in the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we'd ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. Mr. Carey, why don't we begin with you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to appear before you today. I am Bob Carey. I was the Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, in the Department of Health and Human Services from March of 2015 through January of 2017. ORR, in addition to its work on behalf of refugees, asylees, and other vulnerable populations, is responsible for the care and maintenance of unaccompanied children while they are in U.S. government custody and their placement with U.S.-based sponsors while they go through their immigration proceedings. The placement process includes vetting of sponsors to verify their relationship to the child and the suitability of the placement. The overwhelming majority of sponsors are immediate or close family members. The vetting process is rigorous and is derived from a range of sources, including records obtained from the countries of origin through their U.S. consulates and documentation provided by U.S.-based sponsors. There are, however, limitations on ORR's capacity to review information obtained both prior to and after the release of children. The office and the agency in which it is housed are not investigative or law enforcement bodies. Many of the children profiled in recent coverage were taken into custody at our southern border. They faced physical and sexual violence, human trafficking, forced gang recruitment, and the very real possibility of death in their home countries and in flight. Rather than fall prey to these forces, they fled, often to join family in the U.S. They remain vulnerable even after arriving. It has been alleged that approximately 85,000 children have been lost by ORR. In In fact, most of these children were released to the care of a parent or close relative. I believe that failure to respond to a follow-up phone call from an unknown phone number does not constitute being lost. Recent investigations have documented the use of child labor in workplaces in the U.S., including, among others, unaccompanied children admitted to the U.S. pending adjudication of their asylum claims. There are multiple explanations for this: inadequate funding and enforcement of existing child protection and labor laws, outdated statutes that allow large corporations to skirt workplace responsibility by using intermediaries, partisan politics designed to divide and demonize foreign-born people, and insufficient coordination among government agencies, among others. Since I left ORR, Congress has repeatedly directed ORR to enhance protections for children. In response, ORR has dramatically increased the number of children who receive post-release services. Properly implemented post-release social services, often referred to as PRS, are essential to ensuring the safety, stability, and transition to permanency of unaccompanied children released from government custody to sponsors in the United States. I am pleased to see ORR's progress, as I believe these vital services are vital tools to ensure a child's safety while they go through immigration court processes. Further, ORR has stated that it plans to provide legal representation to 100% of unaccompanied children by the end of fiscal year 27, which is an essential objective. No less crucial for protecting children is access to an attorney. Currently, many, if not most, unaccompanied children lack an attorney. The TVPRA requires that, to the maximum extent practicable, HHS ensure legal counsel for unaccompanied children, to represent them in legal proceedings or matters and protect them from mistreatment, exploitation, and trafficking. This includes mistreatment and exploitation in the workplace. Providing unaccompanied children with attorneys for the duration of their case is one of the best ways to intervene early when children are working in illegal and dangerous conditions, and thus to protect them from abuse. Attorneys also help evaluate children's eligibility for legal protections and supportive services specifically designed for survivors of trafficking, severe crimes, and abuse. This includes work authorization where eligible, which helps older teenagers access safe, lawful, and appropriate employment, and serves as a bulwark against dangerous working conditions, wage theft, and other labor abuses in the unregulated workforce. Let me conclude by reiterating that unaccompanied children are, by and large, children in need. When the exploitation of underage, unaccompanied children occurs, it requires multiple failures. The solutions require addressing all 5 of these factors: accountability for those who exploit children, accountability for those that profit from child labor exploitation, expanded and enhanced access to post-release services, legal services, and child advocates, expanded legal authority and resource to act affirmatively to investigate possible child labor exploitation and to provide protection to affected children, better communication across federal agencies, but also ORR can do a better job of
Mr.
connecting
Carey,
children.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but your time expired about a minute ago.
Thank you for
We'll
your
begin
time.
with questions.
Thank you.
Chair's next, pleased to recognize Ms. Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for having a hearing on this topic, which has been ignored for too long. It's disturbing and sad to hear the stories of what these younger migrants go through. They are no less deserving of personal safety and protection just because of the circumstances under which they arrived. So it's also infuriating, though, because the dysfunction in the ORR placement program has been known for a long time. for about 10 years, since states and local communities that have been dealing with the influx started raising the alarm. But what is most infuriating is that even with all the well-documented risks and problems associated with the federal government taking custody of minors and adults claiming to be minors who are smuggled in and then releasing them to unvetted sponsors and then washing its hands of responsibility for them, even knowing the risks, still the Biden administration chose to throw gasoline on that dumpster fire by actually expanding opportunities for the illegal smuggling of minors into the country and expanding opportunities for these minors to be trafficked for cheap labor, commercial sex, gangs, and more. It was done by dismantling the relatively effective policies enacted by prior administrations that had tried not only to improve the UIC placement system and mitigate the risk of trafficking, but to decrease the flow of child migrants. Under the Biden policies, the annual number of UACs referred to HHS custody after crossing illegally has tripled, from an average of 40,000 a year to more than 120,000 in each of the last 2 years. Half of the 600,000 unaccompanied minors who've been released in the country since 2012 have arrived on Biden's watch. Not only did he relax border controls and suppress immigration enforcement inside the country, when the numbers predictably exploded, his officials responded by gutting what few meager protections for child migrants still existed. As HHS Secretary Becerra revealed in his now notorious video statement, the goal was to release these kids faster with fewer questions asked, to make it a more efficient assembly line. And this assembly line is staffed by crony contractors spending billions of taxpayer dollars on what is now a pipeline for child labor trafficking. It is truly an urgent task for Congress to address this problem. There is no question that the placement process for UACs can be improved. These improvements should be informed by experts like those here today who know the system, by child welfare agencies within the states and communities where the migrants are placed, and by the federal immigration and other law enforcement agencies who understand the smuggling and trafficking business. We need these improvements, and we need more oversight on HHS and its contractors. Just last night, I got a message from an insider voicing their concern about how HHS lets its contractors operate the youth migrant shelters with unlicensed and untrained staff who apparently are utterly unqualified to be in charge of these kids. We would never allow this to happen in a school or any other juvenile setting involving American kids. But fixing the shelter and placement system is not going to solve the problem, really. Based on my experience, I see no chance that the federal government can construct a system for processing unaccompanied illegal alien minors that is up to the task of handling the huge number of kids, more than 120,000 last year, who will continue to come, who will continue to be put in the hands of criminal smugglers, traffickers, unscrupulous employers, abusive sponsors, as long as they know that they're going to be released into the country once they get here. The fundamental problem which Congress can solve is with the law. First, the loopholes in the TVPRA must be closed, allowing the government to swiftly repatriate the minors to their homes if they are not at risk, which most are not. And Congress must direct and fund ICE to boost its anti-trafficking and its worksite enforcement activities to go after the illegal and exploitative employment of the young migrants. It is also imperative to restore ICE's authority to arrest sponsors who it finds have been involved in the smuggling or trafficking or illegal employment of these minors, which was taken away from them by the Harris Amendment that passed a couple of years ago, which I noted in my written statement. Congress should use its appropriations authority to force HHS and DHS to have meaningful coordination with state and local governments and their child welfare agencies. And finally, Congress should reform other provisions in the law that entice minors to come illegally, such as the Special Immigrant Juvenile Program, which should be limited to accommodate only those youth who have no responsible parent or guardian to care for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And next we'll hear from Ms. Rodriguez for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman and members of the committee, for giving me this opportunity to present my eyewitness testimony and express my concerns regarding what is happening to the children at the southern border because of the current administration's policies. I am Sheena Rodriguez, founder and president of Alliance for a Safe Texas. As a U.S. citizen, mother, and former educator who deeply cares about our country and the welfare of all children, I was compelled to see for myself what was occurring at our southern border. I have been to various parts of the border in Texas and Arizona nearly 36 times in under 2 years. What I have witnessed would and should disgust and terrify every American. In April 2021, when Texas Governor Greg Abbott learned of allegations of abuse of unaccompanied minors in a federal facility in San Antonio, he stated, quote, "The Biden administration is presiding over the abuse of children." He also called on the administration to shut these facilities down. Instead, the administration has only expanded them without communicating with state and local authorities. Local communities are not told how long the minors will be there or where they will go when they are released, and with no concern to the local of impact to the local cities. I am requesting that Congress launch a full investigation into the federal agencies responsible for approving these contracts. These are just a handful of many examples I have encountered. During one border trip to the Del Rio area in December of 2021, the group I was with encountered 6 men who had illegally entered the U.S. and were hiding in the brush. They surrounded our vehicle, believing that we were their transport to smuggle them further into the U.S. When we spoke to them, they said that they had witnessed cartel operatives murder children who were traveling alone and could not pay the smuggling fees. One man claimed he witnessed children being used and traded as currency. In another encounter in La Jolla, I met and spoke with a 10-year-old Honduran girl who arrived by herself carrying only a small piece of paper with handwritten phone numbers on it. She stated the numbers were given to her by a woman in an NGO along the route, who told the young girl the numbers were to her father, who she said that she would be staying with, a man the young girl claimed she had never met or spoken to. Also in La Jolla, I met a 14-year-old girl reportedly abused by her father and claimed that she was held for 11 days in a bodega and abused further. Similarly, she was told by a stranger that she would be going to stay with her mother, who the teen claimed, again, she did not know. I also met teenage boys between the ages of 14 to 17 who claimed cartel operatives often transported children through Mexico and held them at the bodegas where armed cartel members stood guard. Many were told they were going to stay with sponsors in America, with several claims, again, that the teens had never met or personally communicated with their supposed sponsors. Since January 2021, there have been over 356,000 UACs encountered at the southern border, a majority of which have been released into the U.S., more than 10,000 of which that have been released in my respective area of North Texas. The current administration has admitted that they do not keep track of the whereabouts when they are released into the U.S. With the use of taxpayer dollars, tens of thousands of children are simply missing. How many of the missing children are in my city or in yours? This has forced the state of Texas to take actions we never should have had to take as a direct result of the failed federal policies. Currently, we have bipartisan support for my state-level legislative-sponsored letter calling for a state investigation into the trafficking of unaccompanied minors in Texas. I am calling on Congress to investigate the federal agencies responsible for these minors, to locate these children, and to act with urgency to end the policy of releasing UACs in the U.S. with sponsors and non-family members they do not know. I am also calling on Congress to require that all alleged family members undergo a DNA test. The abuse of children is not a political or partisan issue. It is a humanitarian and legal issue. I am calling on Congress to investigate the actions of DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, HHS Secretary Xavier Becerra, and Border Czar Vice President Kamala Harris, and to identify their role in facilitating the abuse of children through federal agencies and demand that they be held accountable. I agree with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who describes what is happening as, quote, effectively the largest human smuggling operation in American history. We can no longer turn a blind eye and pretend that this isn't happening. Congress has the power to stop this, which is why I'm calling on you to do what is right. Americans and these children deserve no less. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Our final witness is Ms. Rodas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman McClintock, Ranking Member Japal, and distinguished members of the committee. It is an honor to be here. I thank you for the invitation to share my testimony. My goal is to inspire action to safeguard the lives of migrant children, including the staggering 85,000 that are missing. Today, children will work overnight shifts at slaughterhouses, factories, restaurants to pay their debts to smugglers and traffickers. Today, children will be sold for sex. Today, children will call a hotline to report they are being abused, neglected, and trafficked, and we don't know if they're going to get the help they need. For nearly a decade, unaccompanied children have been suffering in the shadows, and I have to confess I knew nothing about their suffering until 2021, when I volunteered to help the Biden administration with the crisis at the southern border. As part of Operation Artemis, I was deployed to the Pomona Fairplex Emergency Intake Site in California to help HHS, Office of Refugee Resettlement, reunite children with sponsors in the United States. I thought I was going to help place children in loving homes. Instead, I discovered that children are being trafficked through a sophisticated network that begins with recruiting in home country, smuggling to the U.S. border, and ends when ORR delivers a child to a sponsor. Some sponsors are criminals and traffickers and members of transnational criminal organizations. Some sponsors view children as commodities and assets to be used for earning income. This is why we are witnessing an explosion of labor trafficking. Now, whether it's intentional or not, it could be argued that the United States government has become the middleman in a large-scale, multi-billion-dollar child trafficking operation that is run by bad actors seeking to profit off of the lives of children. As for me, my interest is the safety of the children. I do not view this as a political issue. I view this as a humanitarian issue. I assure you, my motives are the highest and best. I want the children protected. So I want to tell you some of what I witnessed personally at the Pomona Fairplex. I saw vulnerable indigenous children from Guatemala who speak Mayan dialects and cannot speak Spanish. That means they cannot ask for help in English. They cannot ask for help in Spanish. They become captives of their sponsors. I have sat with case managers as they've cried to tell me the horror of what has happened to children as they make the journey to this country. I saw apartment buildings where 20, 30, and 40 unaccompanied minors have been released. I saw sponsors trying to simultaneously sponsor children from multiple ORR sites at one time. I saw sponsors using multiple addresses to obtain sponsorships of children. And I saw numerous cases of children in debt bondage, and the child knew they had to stay with the sponsor until the debt was paid. Realizing that we were not offering the children the American dream, but instead putting them in modern-day slavery with wicked overlords was a terrible revelation. A terrible revelation. These children are a captive victim population with no access to law enforcement or knowledge of their rights. They are extorted, abused, neglected, and that is why I blew the whistle in 2021. I witnessed firsthand the horrors of child trafficking and exploitation. My life will never be the same after what I saw, but I have hope because I'm counting on you. It's my hope that you'll take action to end this crisis, to safeguard the lives of these vulnerable children. People have asked me, what can be done? What would you suggest? Well, first, I think HHS's #1 priority is oversight. They must commit to oversight, transparency, and accountability. If I could wave a magic wand, this, I believe, could be quickly solved by experts in the IG community. There is a Pandemic Analytics Center of Excellence, or the PACE, as we call it. I believe if data analysts at the PACE could look at the data, children could be rescued, criminals could be prosecuted. If the PACE had access to this data, it shows where the children are and who has them. I think also we need to change the culture of speed over safety. speed is the wrong performance measure when dealing with children. We need to revamp the vetting process of sponsors and have case managers who have investigative backgrounds, data analytics backgrounds, some certified fraud examiners. And I think we need to reimagine a system where the sponsor is the accountable party. Sponsors should be required to report to ORR. And lastly, stop retaliating against whistleblowers. Stop retaliating against the people who are trying to tell the truth to save the children. As it is written, a wise man listens to advice, while a fool continues in his folly, and HHS needs to be wise to care for these children.
Thank you very much. Your time's expired.
Okay, thank you
5 seconds.
for the opportunity.
You're very welcome, and we'll get to questions now. Under the 5-minute rule, would begin Mr. Van Drew of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank you for whistleblowing. It's people like you and all of you that when you come forward and tell the truth, those are big words. Tell the truth. You know what? You want to know, and I'm going to be a little different, and I'm going to be a little bit political, because we have the other side of the aisle saying that we're hurtful, we're cruel, we're harsh, we're inhumane, our bill is bad. They were in the majority when this was all done. This is their plan. I've spoken to Mr. Mayorkas numerous times, more than once, more than twice, more than 3 times, and he has told me that there's nothing wrong. Everything is fine, everything is good, our system is working, and it's better than ever. The bottom line is we changed the system a number of years ago where we opened our gates, we opened our doors, but we don't have all the ability to take care of everybody all the time, and that's the truth. We have enough problems in America that we can only help legal immigrants and do things at a certain pace. We just can't let the gates be open, and that is exactly what was happening under this administration. It's exactly what they've done. I don't want to be partisan. Believe it or not, I don't like being partisan, but I have to be in this case, because when Mr. Mayorkas tells me nothing is wrong, when you see that adults are pretending to be children in some cases as well and taking advantage, when you see little babies that are just tossed aside, when you see children that are bought and sold, used for sex slavery and worse multiple times, I mean, the stories are horrific. I know how you were sick. And you know what? I don't want anybody from the other, if we want to find solutions, we have solutions. And people have to stay home or go back home, and we need legal immigration, and we need a border that really works, a border that is solid, a border that doesn't allow this to happen to children. But you know what the real goal here is? To bring in as many undocumented people, and you talked about speed, and that's the way they're doing it, as they possibly can, as fast as they can, to just bring them in so the numbers go up double, triple. We see just millions upon millions of undocumented illegal immigrants. It doesn't do them good. It certainly doesn't do these children good, and that's what's cruel, that's what's harsh, that's what's inhumane, that's what's wrong in what's going on, and it has to be stopped. We do need a system, and we do have to look at HHS. That should have been done in the beginning 2 years ago when this all started. We weren't in control. We didn't have the ability to do it. We talked about it. We asked about it. We pushed for a change, but we didn't have the ability to do it. So I don't want anybody, and if they can do it, but man, you come to me and say that it's my fault in the minority at the time, or that it was the Republicans' fault, or that we're mean, bad people that want to hurt. No, this is the system that you all set up on the other side of the aisle. This is your system, this is what you did, this is what you made, and of course it's not going to work. Of course it's worse. It is so much better if they're trying to bring children that are undocumented over, let them go back to their home. Let them go through a legal process. I know it takes time, but it's the only way that it's going to work. We're destroying our country. We're hurting little babies. We're destroying other countries in the way that we're doing this. And what we're also doing is making a place for the cartels in America. I read somewhere recently, they said, you know, our latest challenge is going to be, it's going to have to be like the military to go after the cartels. The cartels shouldn't even be in America. They shouldn't have the ability to do this to these children. these children and their families, whatever, are given false hope and false aspirations, and I'm tired of it. And I'm tired of being blamed for something that somebody else made, that somebody else created, that we didn't do. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Oh, well, I'm sorry. I'm going to actually yield, yes.
Hey, thanks, I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Carey, during your tenure of about 2 years, there were 93,000, roughly 93,000 unaccompanied minors that came to HHR, or excuse me, ORR during your time. Is that a fair number? Fair statement? You need to put the microphone on.
I would have to check on those numbers.
That's what the official website indicates. Okay. And are you familiar that since January 2021, there's been 356,000, just under 357,000 unaccompanied children that have come across?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Thank you, I'll yield. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Jayapal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to discuss the 85,000 so-called lost children that we've heard so much about in this committee. Mr. Carey, as you testified, the New York Times wrote a detailed article with some very concerning stories related to unaccompanied children unlawfully working in some very dangerous conditions, and I've said before that these incidents are extremely upsetting. They need to be addressed. The article also discussed how the Office of Refugee Resettlement did not know the whereabouts of those 85,000 unaccompanied children who have been released to sponsors since the Biden administration began. Many outlets and some of my colleagues have latched onto this headline to claim that the Biden administration has, quote, lost 85,000 children. And so I want to start with the most important question, because you ran the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Are those children actually lost by the federal government?
No, they are not. Approximately 85%, and during my tenure, 90% of those children were going to parents or very close relatives. Upwards of 70%, I believe, were going to their parents. So it was the reunification of families that was taking place. Now, it is true that some of those calls are not answered. However, not answering a phone call, I do not believe constitutes losing a child. There are some very legitimate reasons why those calls might not be answered. They are unknown numbers from the U.S. government. They're not recognized. I think that, understandably, people do not answer calls from unknown numbers. They may be fearful of traffickers, I don't know, other forces. So, in short, I do not believe that constitutes being lost.
So when somebody says lost, what they're talking about is that a phone call to verify and speak to the child was not answered, and then that gets constituted as, quote, lost. So if I remember correctly, in 2018, the previous administration was accused of the same issue when headlines appeared stating that the Trump administration lost 1,500 children in a 3-month period. Is that correct?
Yes.
And those claims were untrue as well?
I believe those claims were in fact true because the families were separated. Some children went at the time of entry, they were separated, and there were databases that did not track where the parents went and where the children went. So the situation was substantially different.
And you're talking about a time when the Trump administration actually separated thousands of children from their families. In fact, I remember going and visiting some of those parents in a federal detention center. They had no idea where their parents were, and in fact, the government had no idea where those kids were. Can you discuss why the Office of Refugee Resettlement does not do more in its follow-up? I mean, that is one of the things that has been raised that I think we all want to understand. In your opinion, what more could the Office of Refugee Resettlement be doing?
Well, I think it's important to understand what the parameters are on the ORR office operations. The statutory authority granted to ORR extends only up to the time of release. So ORR has no authority to track or to investigate. It's not an investigatory body. Or a law enforcement body. So while substantial resources are directed in that area, it lacks the expertise, tools, staff, and resources to conduct investigatory processes.
And so you mentioned in your testimony that ORR has no authority over children working, for example, illegal child labor. Is that correct? ORR, who has responsibility for that?
That would be the Department of Labor, I believe.
So that is really not a function of ORR. I want to thank you, Mr. Carey, because I think this question of additional post-release services, and in fact, even some of the Republican witnesses have talked about this, I think that's an area that we believe is important to ensure that there are in-person follow-ups, to ensure that there is appointment of counsel. That's something we didn't cover, but that's only going to help ensure that these kids stay safe and that their claims are heard. So I appreciate your testimony. It's important that we get the facts out there, that we don't use the word lost in a way that's not factual, because really what we're talking about is a phone call was made and that was not responded to. That phone call was not responded to for all the reasons that you mentioned. I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Biggs of Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do think it's interesting that the ranking member of the subcommittee earlier today in the previous hearing referred to the crisis at the border as the so-called crisis, just like she referred to 85,000 lost children as so-called lost children. I think that gives you the mindset that you need to see. When I was down at La Jolla one time, I remember with CBP agent and I, we went down there, and if you remember how it is in La Jolla, you go and you can watch people coming across the river, and they're coming up the road, and there's a sign that tells them where to go, which way to go, because that's where CBP is. It's just myself and an agent. It's nighttime, and we saw a group, and they saw us. We're 200 yards away. There's 150 or so of them. They don't want to come because they're not quite sure who we are. So we yell at them, we're Border Patrol, come on up. So they come on up. There was nobody over the age of 18. No one. We had kids who were 3 years old coming across. Who were they coming with? A coyote had brought them across the river and said, go your own way. We'll go with this group of people. Is that humane, Ms. Rodas? Ms. Rodriguez, is that humane?
No, absolutely not.
Ms. Vaughn?
No, not at all. There's policies that entice people to come like that. And frankly, if we're talking about relying on phone calls as so-called monitoring of kids post-placement, that's not.
I'm going to get into that. Don't go there yet. I'm going to get into that. I've been in Yuma, and I have seen the evidence of kids being reused to create a family unit. Same kid over and over again. Rent a kid. Not humane. But we're told that calling 85,000 children lost that have been placed, and by the way, it's not 90% going to parents anymore. It's a third or less going to parents in today's statistics and numbers. That ranking member wants to get the facts out. Those are the facts. Now, Ms. Rodas, you have said that the U.S. government is the middleman in a multi-billion-dollar migrant child trafficking operation. What did you mean when you used the term middleman? Microphone, please.
So the United States government is receiving the children from the smugglers at the border. And HHS is a $2.7 trillion agency, and over the last 2 years has spent approximately $10 billion. So they are using that money to receive those children and then transport those children to the end user.
And when you say end user, we're not talking necessarily even a blood relative. So I heard a Democrat witness talk about vetting. Can any of you talk about vetting? I mean, I could talk about vetting, but I want to hear from the witnesses. Tell us about the vetting that you've observed.
Well, in my personal capacity as the deputy of the federal case management team, vetting, I would like to say, with Mr. Carey, what he said is they are not an investigative organization, nor are they law enforcement. There was no one, I was shocked and I am stunned that there is no one with law enforcement experience overseeing where children are going. You have people applying for children who we know are members of transnational criminal organizations, yet there's no one with any data analytics background or anything like that overseeing this operation. It doesn't really pass the common sense test when we're pumping billions of dollars into a program that's overseen by people who simply are not qualified to do the job. When one individual can sponsor 20 or 30 or 40 people and no one's asking a question about it, there's something seriously wrong and flawed with that program.
That's ultimately how they found that one child in Yuma, because everybody was going to the same place in Charleston, South Carolina. Ms. Vaughn, you were going to expand on the phone calls, which I agree with you. I only have time to ask the question, what goes on in that phone call? And then I want to submit some stuff for the record, Mr. Chairman, after she's done.
Am I, okay.
Briefly.
Yeah. A phone call is not sufficient to detect whether the child is in a safe environment. A phone call is not enough to know if a child is being abused, if a child is in a forced labor trafficking situation. That is not acceptable monitoring and shouldn't be considered monitoring at all. That is just a contractor going through the motions of trying to see if a child is there. And frankly, I think almost all of these kids are actually lost because the federal government is taking no responsibility
The
for
gentleman's
them.
time's expired, but you have some unanimous consent requests?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a letter that I wrote to ORR, the director of ORR, in October, in her response in January of this year, admitting that they had lost contact with more than 42,000 children.
Okay, without objection. We now recognize Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Carey, I want to discuss the vetting process that the Office of Refugee Resettlement undertakes before it releases any unaccompanied child to a sponsor. To hear some of the news organizations talk about this process, you'd think that children are just given to anyone. It's really much more extensive than that. Can you discuss the assessment that ORR does of each sponsor? What kind of application, interview, and background checks does each potential sponsor undergo?
Certainly, and I'd like to point out that at the time that the children are turned over to ORR from CPB, there is documentation that they have determined is valid or worth passing on. So before a child enters ORR custody, there has been a vetting process, and that continues for that is why children tend to be in RR care for, on average, 1 month, where the ongoing vetting process takes place. And it is a rigorous one. It involves relationships with the countries of origin where primary information is available. Any documentation that is available from the sponsors, including fingerprinting, license information, whatever, checks against multiple databases, including those for criminal records or anything of that sort. So it is a rigorous process, and it goes on for at least a month. So establishing family relations that are done in concert with the countries of origin and original documents are obtained.
Despite the fact that there have been some pretty heartbreaking stories of sponsors being traffickers or using the children to work, it's my understanding that this past fiscal year, over 85% of sponsors are close family members. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And would you say that that percentage is about on par with what you saw when you were the director of ORR under the Obama administration?
It was very close. It may have changed. It varies over time, so a percentage or two different, but roughly the same.
And can you share any experiences you had as director of ORR of reuniting an unaccompanied minor with their family in the United States?
Yes, in many instances, it is known that families have been separated for extended periods of time. Children have been traumatized in their home countries. Rule of law is limited. They've often been targeted by gangs or violent elements, often as they reach adolescence. So children are being put in the care of their families. which is, I believe, where children should be, if at all possible. And it has been established that congregate care facilities are not an ideal location and are in fact harmful for children. So I do think that ORR is reuniting families, and that's the authority that was given to it by Congress. So the research is rigorous, it's exhaustive, and it's based on whatever information is available. But as I said before, ORR is not an investigatory body, so there are limits as to what it can do. There are databases, there are fingerprinting, there are background checks, and there are interviews.
Thank you. Based on what we're hearing today, the reality is that the issues Ms. Rodas and the New York Times have flagged should not be happening under current law and policy. I'm very glad that ORR has announced that it's conducted an audit of its vetting process. Mr. Carey, can you discuss the inherent tension that exists between trying to ensure the safety of all these children while also ensuring that children are not held in ORR custody for a long period of time?
Yes, it is a delicate process because children could, in theory, be kept in care indefinitely. But the goal is ultimately to reunite children with a caregiver, with a parent, with a family member, or an individual who is designated by their parent as the ideal sponsor. So it's important that children be closely, their placement be closely vetted, which it is to the extent possible, but also paramount that children can be reunited with a family member and placed in a home environment.
Thank you. I'd like to submit, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record the testimony of the Director of ORR in front of the House Oversight Committee that more than 85% of unaccompanied kids are reunited with their families.
Without objection,
Thank you. I yield back.
the chair now recognizes Mr. Roy of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. I would note that were my child one of the 15%, even if I take the chairman or the ranking member, I should say, at his word, I would be pretty frustrated about your child being lost. If you send your kids to school and they say, well, we kept up with 85% of them, boy, would you feel good about the education system? Because what about those other 15% of kids? Even if you take the ranking member at his word. I've got a FOIA request here from Judicial Watch from, this is now 6 years dated, that has a laundry list of incidents put out by ORR through a FOIA request detailing laundry list of abuses of children. This one, young girl reported she was inappropriately touched by an unknown male immigrant in the group after entering the U.S. Another one, several appeals reported staff they were inappropriately touched. Another one where somebody paid money to have sex with her. Another, I can just go down the list of hundreds of these examples. And somehow in the greatest country in the history of the world, the most powerful country in the history of the world, we think this is a system that we should defend. It blows my mind that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to defend a system of laws that allows this to occur to children and then brush away that MAGA extremist New York Times for daring to point out that 85,000 kids aren't being found from the first contact, my colleagues on the side of the aisle say. Oh, okay. We just didn't get them on that first call. I would ask each of the witnesses very quickly, do you think that the data is showing that since President Biden took office that 356,665 unaccompanied alien children have crossed the southern border that we know of and been placed in HHS custody? Is a system that attracts that number of children unaccompanied to come across our border, to be exploited by cartels, to be put into the sex trafficking trade, to be put into the slave labor trade, to be sexually abused, to die on ranches in South Texas, to drown in the Rio Grande? Yes or no? Is that a system that you're proud of as an American and that you think is good?
No, Congressman.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Rodriguez.
No, sir, I'm appalled.
Ms. Vaughn.
No, indeed.
Mr. Carey. It's yes or no question. Are you proud of a system in this country that has 356,000 unaccompanied alien children that allow that to occur to children? That we know, by your own acknowledgement and testimony, by our own understanding, children are being abused, raped, they get killed in this process. The system that we've created to allow and attract that flood across our border, do you think that is a good system, and are you proud of it as an American?
These children are fleeing violence and threats of death in their country of
The
origin.
numbers have been spiking under this administration because of the policies of this administration, and it is well documented. I just want to make clear, you're standing behind the policies of this administration, that you're proud of these policies and what that is allowing to occur to these children.
I do not currently work for the administration. I was
Doesn't matter to me. Are you proud of this administration's policies and what currently is occurring to these children because of the policies attracting 356,000 unaccompanied alien children when we know the data? 85,000 lost, reams of scores. You worked there, you know, of the rapes, of the people getting killed, of the slave labor. Do you think this is a system that we should say we're proud of?
I believe we should provide protection to children who are fleeing death and persecution.
Let me ask you a different
And
question.
they should be allowed an opportunity for
Do you
determination.
believe that the TVPRA policies adopted, that unchecked and unfixed by this current Democratic administration and by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, did that have anything to do with attracting all of those children across the border?
Well, I do believe that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is an important component of U.S. child protection.
Is it a
policy.
magnet right now, the way it is currently constructed, why children were riding on the top of train cars? President Obama was appalled. Jay Johnson was appalled. This administration doesn't seem to care. Yes or no, is our current system a magnet to kids?
I do not believe it is.
You don't believe it's a magnet?
No.
Well, that's the problem. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you. Ms. Rodriguez, welcome, and thank you for coming today to testify. Ms. Rodriguez, were you at the Capitol on January 6th?
Was I at the Capitol?
Yes.
No, sir. I was on the premises outside of a reflection pond, waving a flag.
So you were on the Capitol grounds?
I'm not sure if that's technically Capitol grounds. I was near the street.
Is this your tweet right behind me at 3:05 on January 6th, 2021?
I really do not know.
Are you at Secure Border TX?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you see that picture?
I can.
Did you go any farther than where you were in that picture?
No, sir.
Did you ever cross any police barricades on January 6th?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did you ever see any violence on January 6th?
No, I did not. I did see a red flare go up. I don't remember the time, but that was about it. I did not encounter any violence. As a matter of fact, it was quite peaceful. I was involved in some prayers the day before.
So, January 6th, over 150 officers were injured. One lost an eye, one lost a finger, one lost a life, but you didn't see any violence.
No, sir, I did not. That was not my experience.
You agree, though, that violence against police officers took place that day?
Sir, I'm not quite sure what this has to do with the exploitation of children, like the young girl who wore this band.
Sure. I guess, you were called, you publicly tweeted this, the majority knew that you were on the Capitol grounds on January 6th. And so, your credibility is, just as every witness, including the Democratic witness, is fair grounds for questioning. And so I guess my question is, you are aware that violence took place at the Capitol on January 6th.
That's what the media says.
Okay. Do you believe the media?
Inherently, I do
No,
not.
about January 6th.
About January 6th, I can only go by my personal experience, and I absolutely, if waving a flag and praying outside of the Supreme Court and standing outside waving a flag on public property is a crime, I'm not quite, again, I'm really not sure what relevance, we have children that are being raped
But others-
using our taxpayer dollars.
there were
I'm
not
not
waving-
quite sure what this has to do with me waving a flag has to do with.
You were among a crowd that did commit violence. And my question for you is, and I accept your word, you did not commit any violence that day, you didn't see any violence that day. Certainly, it's not a lie, it's not made up that 150 officers were injured. But my question is, to your credibility, will you condemn the violence that took place against the
Absolutely.
officers that day?
I absolutely condemn any violence, including the violence that is occurring at our southern border using our taxpayer dollars. Absolutely.
Okay. And did you tell the majority before they invited you here that you had participated on the Capitol grounds on January 6th?
Did I tell the majority that I waved a flag on?
Did they know that
Public
you had
grounds?
been at the Capitol on
That
January?
was not a question that I was asked, no, sir.
And as it relates to January 6th, you also posted a tweet that encouraged people to attend that day and, quote, fight for Trump. Do you remember writing on January 1, 2021, imagine over 1 million patriots screaming, fight for Trump. Think Congress and the Supreme Court will hear us. When you say fight for Trump and then there was actually fighting, physical fighting on behalf of Trump, what
Sir,
did you mean?
Are you stating that I tweeted that?
You don't remember tweeting?
No, sir, I honestly do not.
Okay, so on January 1, 2021, you sent a tweet that said, imagine over 1 million patriots screaming, quote, fight for Trump on the 6th. Think Congress and SC, which I believe is Supreme Court, will hear us then. Hashtag fight for Trump. Your testimony is that you did not say that.
I'm saying I honestly do not remember tweeting that. I was not very active on Twitter.
Well, you also tweeted at 4 o'clock, I just got home, you said I just got whole safely. I think you meant home. At BWI Airport, as the gate filled up with those of us with Trump gear on and several Army soldiers, near time to boarding, our gate was surrounded by airport
The
security.
gentleman yield for a moment?
No, I will not yield. So you tweeted regularly throughout the days leading up to January 6th. You asked people to fight for Trump, and then you took a picture of yourself near the Capitol. So I just want to know, when you say fight for Trump, and people ultimately fought for Trump, do you regret those words?
Sir, I do, the second one that you just read, yeah, because that was a very traumatic experience. I couldn't understand why my gate surrounding, in BWI was surrounded by guardsmen, and how we as a whole, everyone that was on that plane, were threatened to be removed. I could not understand because, again, I did not experience any type of violence. As far as the first one that I would have to go back and look at that. I really do not honestly remember tweeting
Sure,
that first.
I'll make sure we
Gentleman's
give
time
it
has
to you.
expired. Mr.
And
Bell.
I just want to correct, I said January 6th for the BWI Airport. It was January 7. I just want to, January 7 was when you tweeted about
Mr.
BWI.
Nels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rodriguez, I apologize that you had to, you're here for a hearing on the border. They don't want to talk about a border. Mr. Swalwell is down there. Obviously, everybody knows he's made some comments. He's got a checkered past. He's alleged
I'm sorry, I have
relationships.
a checkered past. I would
alleged-
ask,
It's my time.
Mr.
Alleged affairs,
checkered
relationships
past?
with
No,
with
sir.
Yum
You
Yum.
don't get to say that shit. That's not
He had
true.
alleged relationships with
And-
Yum Yum.
I asked the
Now he's
gentleman,
angry.
I asked the gentleman's words to be taken down.
You don't get to say
Mr.
that,
Chairman,
pal.
I asked the
We ask that
gentleman's
the
words to be
gentleman's
taken down as casting a slur on another member.
Will,
That is-
I am here.
He's making,
I asked the
let's have
words
some
of the
order
gentleman
and
be taken down as
civility.
casting a
Let
slur on
us
another
have-
member.
Let us have some order and civility here, and we will take up the issues one by one.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that the words of the gentleman be taken down as expressing a slur on another member.
I join in that request.
And the specific words were?
he mentioned that Mr. Swalwell had a checkered past. I don't have the rest of the exact words, but it was a direct slur on a member of this committee. That is not acceptable.
We're going to consult the precedents and take temporary recess.
Thank you.
Does the gentleman wish to withdraw his words?
Yes, and I would like to rephrase. This is the same member that was removed from the Intelligence Committee that he previously served on. So now let's get right down to the serious business as it relates to our southern border. My question is more related to those who claim to be minors but pose as the adults. I've got several articles in here. Border Patrol nabs hundreds of illegal immigrant adults posing as children. Border Patrol nabs 8 illegal immigrants who pose as unaccompanied minors to avoid deportation. This is an article here with our school districts across the country that are dealing with this. This is from city officials in Lynn, Massachusetts, that talked about adults now, adults that are in this country. They pose as minors, they're in this country, and now we've got 23, 24, 25, 30-year-old people in our high schools. Think about that. They're in our high schools. They're across the entire country. City Superintendent of Schools there, Catherine Latham, in Lynn, Massachusetts, said this is out of control. They have, these individuals are in their schools. There's very little documentation. It says federal policy prohibits city officials from inquiring into a child's immigration or citizenship status and background. We've got problems here, folks. We've got problems, and the left is just continuing to ignore it. They're ignoring it. Mr. Carey, what proof, since we got individuals coming in here, they're old, what proof is required to determine a minor's age?
Well, you talked about screening at the border, so Customs and Border Protection, I believe, is the law enforcement entity
Okay.
that determined that these children...
DNA, my
not to be-
friend, do they do?
Well, I think these children were determined not to be eligible as minors before they would have been turned over to ORR.
Okay.
So a law enforcement body determined that they were not minors,
Right.
and they did not go into ORR.
Yeah, so DNA, birth certificates, passports, medical records, what does somebody need to produce?
Well, in fact, birth records and a host of other materials are
Okay.
collected both from country of origin and...
What happens if they don't have any of these documents, sir?
Well, I believe there are individual circumstances, and those are, in fact...
What is the protocol then?
Well, I think it would vary greatly. I do not know what it is currently because I am
Okay.
not in the office.
All right, this guy here behind me, I'd like to spend a moment with this guy. This guy here, 24 years old, he posed as a minor. He comes into this country, shares a fake name. Not him, he wasn't a minor. He said he was 16, 17, comes in, he's 24 years old. ORR releases him, they send him to Florida. He's over there hanging out with a fella, his sponsor, not a father, not a mother, just a sponsor. And what does he do? A few short months later, he kills him. He kills him. Now, I don't know what the protocol is down there, but when I look at this guy, he's got more chin whiskers than more 40-year-olds have. Look at that guy. Now, how does a guy like that get into this country as a minor? He comes in, he says, my name is such and such, no such name. And he gets released into this country, and he took a life. There's just more than this guy. There are hundreds, if not thousands of them in this country posing as minors. I could sit here and talk about the MS-13 gangs that are coming in here and harming our American people and our citizens, and what are we doing about it? Ms. Vaughn, I wish I had more time. I do. Ms. Rodriguez, ma'am, thank you for what you do. Thank you for exposing what this administration has done to this country, putting the American people last each and every time. But we're in control now, and I can damn well tell you, help is on its way. Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this year, I joined several of my colleagues on this committee to visit McAllen and Brownsville, 2 Texas border towns. While there, we visited an Office of Refugee Resettlement facility that houses unaccompanied children. All of these children had families or sponsors in the United States who were waiting to take them. We learned that in order to ensure these kids are treated humanely when they leave ORR custody, ORR conducts an assessment of the sponsors to determine that the child is placed in an appropriate environment. What struck me most about our visit to the border was how much our immigration and asylum system relies on nonprofits and community services in areas like McAllen and Brownsville. The Biden administration is working to scale up post-release services through which children and their sponsors are connected to community-based services with the goal of being able to provide these services to every child soon. Unfortunately, this committee has already seen too many proposals this year to strip unaccompanied children of basic protections. The Border Security Enforcement Act would leave kids with a mere cursory screening by law enforcement personnel, lacking child welfare expertise, who would be less likely to pick up on signs of trafficking and exploitation, which I take extremely seriously. As a state legislator, I moved through trafficking bills in North Carolina. It would also result in a summary return of many kids who fled legitimate dangers in their home countries. Children who arrive at our southern border have often escaped violence, human traffickers, and gangs in their own countries. Mr. Kerry, in your opinion, is it better to allow children to remain in the United States if we can properly vet the sponsors, or to summarily deport them with limited due process back to a dangerous situation?
Thank you for the question. It is well documented that these children are coming from 3 of the most violent countries in the world, where there are extrajudicial killings, where children are recruited or targeted by gangs or violent elements at the time they reach adolescence. So no, I do not think return without a proper hearing, a determination of their legal access to asylum is determined with ideally legal representation as recommended by the TVPRA and Flores. I also think a society is defined by the way we treat our most vulnerable, and children are among the most vulnerable. So returning children to a situation in a country where their lives are at risk and some have been killed upon return does not reflect well upon us. I do believe they should have access to a legal hearing that determines the nature that their claim is either valid or invalid.
Thank you very much. And we did hear from some of those children, adolescents, who had left very dangerous situations. Mr. Chairman, just for a brief period of time before I reclaim my time, I'd like to yield about 15 seconds to Mr. Nadler.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Kerry, I just wanted to ask if I'm correct in that what you were saying before is that conditions in their home countries are pushing these people, kids and adults, out, and it does not matter who the president of the United States is or what their policies are, these kids would be coming because of conditions in their home countries.
Yes, absolutely, and that's very well documented.
Thank you very much. I yield back. I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
Thank you. And just, I completely agree with all the witnesses that we need to do more. And when we went to the border, we saw just sad, sad situations with children. And I want you to know, all of you to know, that I am committed to helping, and hopefully in a bipartisan way, helping these children and making sure that they are safe. Mr. Kerry, just in the 10 seconds that we have we seen any improvements in the situation that you think Congress should invest in further?
Absolutely. I think post-release services, which would provide legal representation, social workers on an expanded level, which I know ORR is increasing and would like to have fully in place within the next 2 years, provides another eye on these children, provides a degree of protection that might not otherwise be present. It also, where it's present, over 90% of the children show up at their hearings. If there is a problem, there are entities and individuals who can determine that it exists and refer it to social service providers or law enforcement as appropriate. So I think that is one. I do think that there should be There is fortunately an audit process going at ORR to determine if there are, what the flaws are and how those can be improved upon. I do think that clearer lines of authority and communication between those entities such as ORR, which are in essence social service providers, and law enforcement and other bodies would be an improvement on the current program.
Thank you,
Now,
Mr.
ladies'
Chair,
time
for
is
your indulgence.
Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a week ago, the New York Times reported that the Biden administration has downplayed repeated signs that migrant children are being widely exploited. I would go on record today and say it doesn't sound like just the Biden administration based on what I'm hearing in here, but Ms. Rodas, you mentioned something and it kind of triggered a response a while ago. You said these kids are being recruited in their home country. What do you mean by that?
So, and I'd be happy to submit for the record, we have children saying that there are radio advertisements in their hometowns. So in Huehuetenango, for example, in Guatemala, they're actually advertising on the radio, come with us, we'll give you passage to the United States. There's an example of a sponsor who currently is in Austin, Texas at this moment. He attempted to sponsor 4 children, 1 from the Pomona Fairplex Emergency Intake Site and 3 from the Pecos Emergency Intake Site, promising work to these children who were making $2.50 a day on the coffee farm he owns in Guatemala. So he lured them here. Now, fortunately, they were put into long-term care, but they are being lured here. Facebook ads and other things. Children are being lured here and then put to work here.
So it doesn't sound like they're fleeing as much as they're being baited to come here in a lot of ways from what I'm hearing.
In many ways, they're not fleeing. In many ways, I mean, let's take El Salvador, for example. No one is fleeing from Nayib Bukele. He has a very safe society right now. Yes, maybe in times past, people were fleeing El Salvador from the gangs, but sadly, the gangs have now set up operation here, and we have evidence that there are many of them who are running the networks here who have the children. It's indisputable evidence that Department of Homeland Security has transnational criminal organizations on the TOC watch list, some of who got their fingerprints here in Washington, D.C. and neighboring areas, are sponsoring the children. It's indisputable.
You mentioned too, debt bondage. What do you mean when you say debt bondage, and who does the money go to?
So the money goes to the trafficker who ultimately brings them here. The New York Times actually showed, I think, Hannah Dreyer did an amazing expose where she actually showed the debt page of the child, how much the child had to pay for food, how much the child had to pay for rent, all of those things.
So the administration is really, we're engaged in creating slavery. We are trafficking slaves to this country.
Absolutely. There is no doubt. We have created a pull, and because this criminal element tragically views children as a commodity, they see us as the middleman because we're paying the flight directly to the end user, the trafficker.
I remember, I was at
that.
Fort Bliss Emergency Intake Center. I mentioned this last week in a hearing, and I was there as they were shipping kids on buses all over the country. And I actually asked the admiral running the place, I said, are we doing background checks? We're sending these kids to Google addresses. And he's like, no, we're just building the bus as we drive it. And so they were just shipping children, American taxpayers, basically, we're trafficking children.
Yes.
And making the cartel wealthy in the process and creating a bunch of minors in bad situations.
Yes, going back to 2014, which was astounding to me because I did not know when I deployed for this mission that one child had ever been trafficked through the program. So the horror when someone sent me the 2016 Senate report, I'm sitting there on the Pomona site seeing all these strange things and all these multiple sponsors at multiple addresses trying to collect these kids from multiple sites. And I read the report and I thought, which side am I on?
Right. Which side are you on?
Which side? Because we know about trafficking all the way back then, how teens were lured from Guatemala, put in slave labor conditions where they were held sometimes at gunpoint and their families were threatened to be killed.
So I've got about 45 seconds. Thank you for being a whistleblower. I guess they didn't treat you very nicely when you blew the whistle.
No, they did not. They threatened me with investigation. They walked me off the emergency intake site and they took my badge. My agency, Thankfully, I work for the Council of the Inspectors General. I'm not here in that capacity, but they actually offered to send agents to retrieve me, to escort me home because they were concerned for my safety. It's a terrible thing when you blow the whistle and to try to save children, and then you are retaliated against for trying to help. HHS did everything they could to keep all of this silent.
Let me ask one more question. You said these kids, that they talk about always sending them to their moms and their dads. You're saying they hand them a piece of paper and tell them this is your mom and this is your dad? Is that what I gathered from the testimony?
Well, as they're making their journey, that happens, but then also the case managers who are not law enforcement, right? They're not investigative. They are receiving documents, photographs of documents on their WhatsApp phone. And there's a perfect example. A 20-plus-year-old man sponsored what we believed was his sister, who was only 16 years old. He submitted a birth certificate for himself and her as brother and sister. And then, about 10 days after she's released, we see she's for sale on his WhatsApp page. You know, her shirt is buttoned down to her navel. She's all made up. The documents, there is no one at HHS vetting the children who is
That's where we need law
capable to
enforcement.
determine.
I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to seek unanimous consent to enter into the record two articles, one from Slate Magazine. Nayib Bukele is Latin America's first millennial dictator, and another one from CNN. Why El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, wants everyone to know about his new prison. This one actually talks about how he went and conducted secret talks with the MS-13 leaders in prison and wanted, essentially was looking to release those gang members. Just wanted to make it clear that we're not talking about a country that has a benevolent government. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Lady is recognized making this consent request, not a speech. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you. In just the first 4 months of 2023, U.S. officials have encountered more than 70,000 unaccompanied children. These children, some of them too young to even fully understand where they are some of the most vulnerable people to go through our immigration system. They desperately need to be shown care and compassion, the same that we should want for any of the children in our own lives. And instead, as we know, they are increasingly being put to work in illegal and unsafe jobs, or even worse, sent back into unsafe conditions or human traffickers. We cannot allow this to happen. But what do our Republican colleagues propose we do about this? Just recently, my colleagues across the aisle passed out of this committee a bill which guts existing protections for unaccompanied children and blocked efforts to allow government-provided lawyers to represent these children at hearings. Simply put, they are making an already complex problem worse. And I know every single Democrat on this side of the dais is ready to do all that we can to improve this effort and ensure that we have the federal resources devoted to ensure that no children are forced to work illegally or in the hands of anyone they shouldn't be. And so I want to ask you, Mr. Kerry, first, we all recognize that more has to be done to protect these vulnerable children. What authorities do you suggest Congress give to help these children? And would government-provided counsel, for example, be helpful to protecting children released to sponsors? What sort of role could an attorney play? And do you think legislation that our colleagues just passed that bans the government from providing counsel to unaccompanied children would result in more exploitation of children or less?
I certainly think it would provide more exploitation. When children are in touch with an attorney, they are in regular touch. It ensures they show up at their hearings, determining whether they have a claim, whether their lives were in danger in their country of origin. It also is an extra party who is seeing the child, who can assess whether they are in physical danger, whether they're going to school, whether they are still living with their parents or their other sponsors. So yes, I do believe that post-release services, which would also include access to social services and a host of other physical health services, ensuring that physical needs are being taken care of, educational services, and linkages with other community-based services for which, to which children are legally entitled to access. So yes, I believe these would be extremely beneficial.
And Mr. Kerry, in your testimony, you also indicated that HHS does not have the authority to investigate what happens to children after they leave HHS custody. What agencies do have the authority to investigate those who might put children in exploitative or dangerous working conditions, or other
Well, I
settings?
think certainly the Department of Labor has the authority to investigate and enforce labor law, and that would certainly extend to the exploitation of children in unsafe working conditions, or underage children working in conditions of that sort. So other law enforcement bodies, I believe, as well, though I'm not expert in that area.
So, what can Congress do to ensure that the Department of Labor, as an example, has what it needs in terms of resources to go after employers who put children in any kind of danger?
Well, I co-authored a piece in Slate with a colleague who's a labor law expert about a month ago. And as she determined, the research that she showed, the Department of Labor is very much underfunded. So the ability to inspect and enforce labor law is, I gather, quite limited. So certainly funding to that body to enable it to investigate and prosecute would, I believe, be a critical factor in reducing the potential for exploitation of children.
And finally, in light of that statement you just made, our colleagues are about to pass a proposal to deal with the default of the United States, where they are proposing massive cuts, a 22% cut, in fact, on HHS, the Department of Labor, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So rather than increases, they're going to be very serious cuts. How would those cuts, which they're going to vote for this afternoon or tomorrow, how would those impact the catastrophe that we've heard about with respect to unaccompanied minors?
Well, I believe that the expansion of post-release services, which is underway and hopefully will be funded, would be a critical element in expanding the protection of children beyond the point at which ORR has the authority to do so. So that is moving forward, and it has expanded in recent years since my departure. But those include mental health services, social work support, physical health services, educational and other community-based services. I think all of these enhance the protection of children beyond the extent that ORR is able to do so. So I think cutting back those services, I think inherently increases the threat to children in society writ large. So.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. First, Ms. Rodriguez, on behalf of the committee, I apologize for the personal attack that was hurled her way and the vile insinuations. That has no place in this committee. Ms. Vaughn, I want to nail down this question of 85,000 children being simply lost by the administration. We're told it's okay, they're just not answering their phones. What does it actually mean to lose track of these children?
Well, HHS has consistently denied that it has any authority or responsibility to.
The point is, they're supposed to be doing follow-up phone calls, correct?
Right. Well, that's what they.
And those follow-up phone calls for those 85,000 children are now simply going unanswered. We don't know where they are. How do we know what has happened to them?
We don't, and that's the problem, and I don't think we really know what happens to those who do answer the phone.
Ms. Rhodes, what kind of vetting is actually done to assure somebody claiming to be a relative actually is?
Well, again,
DNA tests, for example.
as Mr. Carey mentioned, there are no investigative or law enforcement people involved in the vetting process. In my experience with what I witnessed at the Pomona Fairplex emergency intake site, case managers were receiving photographs of documents. There is no way, there was a very small percentage that we were actually able to put through the consulate to verify. People are just going off the word of who is ever sending in the documentation. The vetting process is practically non-existent. They like to talk about a vetting process, but there's no law enforcement involved in the vetting. And so how can there be a vetting process? And there's lots of talk about the post-release services. Post-release services, 25% of the children who we released had it, but it's not enforceable.
Do we send somebody to visit these homes before these children are deposited in them?
No, absolutely not. The history is about 4 to 6% of homes are ever seen. So we're talking about taking a child.
My God, pet shelters offer more vetting than that.
Yes, exactly.
And what kind of follow-up is done
Well-
to assure the welfare of the child?
a phone call that we don't know who's answered, you know, who's answering the call. We cannot verify.
So first of all, when we do make contact, we don't know if we're actually talking to the so-called sponsor.
Exactly.
And for 85,000 of them, they're not even answering. They've just
Congressman.
completely fallen off the radar.
Yes, Chairman, yes.
Ms. Rose, it's been reported that the cartels charge thousands of dollars to traffic these children. How are these debts repaid?
How many debts actually get repaid?
No, how are the debts repaid?
By working and sometimes in slave labor. There was an example when Project Veritas went and knocked on doors in some of the hot spots that I gave them. A 16-year-old girl said she's being pimped by her sponsor, who claims to be her aunt. But the little girl says, I don't know, I've never met her.
Ms. Rodriguez, you have heard similar stories in Texas, is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct. With a lot of especially the younger children that I've personally met along the border, again, they're come with these small little pieces of paper with handwritten numbers on them. They're told, from what they tell me, of who their sponsors are going to be, that this is a lot of them is their tío, like their uncle, their mother, or their father that they've never met, and they don't know who they are until they've never met them.
The Florida grand jury did a 5-month study of this issue in their state and discovered exactly the same thing. So we're seeing that in California, we're seeing it in Texas, we're seeing it in Florida. When we're told these placements are carefully vetted, are we being gaslighted?
Yes, Chairman.
Ms. Vaughn?
Yes, and that's why the state of Florida, for example, the grand jury there is recommending that the state pass a law requiring these sponsors to come forward so that the state can do the vetting, because they know that the federal government is not doing it. It's simply not happening.
Now, if these children were safely returned to their homes, what would that do to the cartel's business model?
It would dry up.
That's what Border Patrol officers have told me when I'm down there, is if you get them safely home, as I said, they don't offer refunds, word will spread very fast, that's a bad investment, and the perilous journey won't be attempted. And can you give us just a little bit of insight into that journey?
Well, we know from reports of NGOs that a very large percentage of the kids who come are abused. Something like at least 60% of the female migrants are abused physically, often sexually. It's a difficult journey. The cartels and the smugglers treat them like commodities. They don't care about whether they get enough food, shelter. It's terribly traumatic, and that's has to be dealt with by the places where they end up.
Thank you. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
I thank the chairman and I thank the ranking member, and of course acknowledge all the witnesses. There are many of us who have lived through this in real time. I have been in the Congress since a number of legislative changes, and as well the lawsuits that resulted in the settlement, the Flores Settlement Agreement from 1997 and the Homeland Security Act of 2002, and the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008. So we've seen the effort to be responsible to the children. I do want to set the record straight, is that during the entire 4 years of the Trump administration, when they abusively took children and separated them from families, it has taken the Biden administration to this time and continuing to try and reunite those families. There was no effort by the past administration to reunite the children. So I think, though it is not attributable to the witnesses, this is a misstatement of this hearing, and I would prefer that we had appropriately named hearings, because I don't think anyone can document the Biden border crisis, exploitation of unaccompanied alien children. I'm not sure if they're trying to suggest the president is exploiting them, or innocent workers are trying to exploit them. I'm not sure what that phraseology means, but I think we need to be precise in what we are speaking of about the abuse of children. I abhor the abuse of children. I have been at the border and I have held unaccompanied children, desperately sent because they come from desperate circumstances. And the whole question of reuniting, or if they can just safely return. Some of these children leave places that no longer exist. Family members are dead, they've been taken over by violence, gangs, and there's nothing there. And so I do think it is important that we stand up a system that respects, coddles, nurtures, and protects these children. So I'm going to start off, Mr. Carey, discussing the 85,000 lost children. I know that you're not in government now, but you've served before. And you know that the New York Times wrote a detailed article with some very concerning allegations related to unaccompanied children, unlawfully working in some very dangerous conditions. The article also talked about how the Office of Refugee Resettlement did not know the whereabouts of about 85,000 unaccompanied children who have been released to sponsors since the Biden administration began. Many outlets and some of my colleagues have latched on to this headline to say that the Biden administration has lost 85,000 children. Let's start with the most important question, but I do want to say this. You were in the Obama administration. Children have been unaccompanied. We saw processes being utilized, not perfect, because in trying to settle children, I know for sure, being at sites where you wanted to make sure that children were going to loving relatives or someone that was going to care for them. In the course of securing sponsors, upon sponsors showing up, and some of these sponsors were the ones that were on the little notes that the children had with a phone number. And so those who are dealing with these children were only trying to get them where they need to be. Again, I reiterate the fact that the children under Trump were snatched away from their families purposely to discourage them from coming. Can you explain why they're not in fact lost? And my time is short, so I'm just going to, and did this same issue also occur during the previous administration? Would you answer that, please?
Yes, thank you. I would contend that, every child receives a call, a follow-up call. Many do not answer. So not answering a phone call, particularly if you're with your parents, I do not believe constitutes being lost. And in many cases, they are known to other bodies, to the legal system which they're going through to hear their claim, to determine if they have if they are, as they're going through that legal process, whether they have an asylum claim. So,
They could be in school, they could be under
Right, yes.
teenagers, children.
Yes, many other entities may well be aware of their location, but especially their parents, to whom they've been released.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Ms. Marks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually went to the border many times in last Congress and recently did. And it's unfortunately that it's not a bipartisan issue because, I'm a mother of 2 teenage girls, and if I would do what done to some of these children, I would be in jail for child neglect. And these kids deserve the same level of protection as everyone else, and we're creating perverse incentives. And unfortunately, I think the pendulum has swung too far with this administration because they really wanted to quickly push kids out of care, that they don't have overwhelmed shelters versus worrying about safety. Because when I went several years ago to Texas to some of the shelters, and I think people who work there was very disturbed that proper background checks were not used, and COVID was used as a pretense to do that. And I don't know, Ms. Rodgers, if you're aware or not, or any of you, that did it stop because we don't have COVID pandemic now? Is it still the background check? I mean, it was inexcusable to use COVID, not really to worry about safety of the children. But if this guidance and this field guidance is still in place, so now they're doing better checks, are you aware, any of you?
Thank you, Congresswoman. To my knowledge, all of the field guidance that was put in place is still in place, which means that background checks for household members are no longer required. So in instances where a person is sponsoring and there's 5 other adult males in the room or in the dwelling, none of them need to go through any type of background check at all. So it is a system that is easily abused, because there are situations where when reporters go knocking on the doors, they're finding a child, unrelated, female, and male as well, living with 5 or 6 adults to whom they are not related.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because now we have traumatized kids with massive debts to cartel, and I guess, cartels don't sue that, but some very creative attorneys do, so no one really dealing with that issue. We have a situation in Indiana, actually, the judges are shocked to see what's happening in some meat packing plants with child labor, and I think no one even realized until, these kids had some violations that they had to go into court system, and it is becoming a huge, huge problem, and I think that shouldn't be a partisan issue. We created child slavery here in this country. We talk about China having slaves. What are we doing in the United States of America with government money? That's unexcusable. And it is a humanitarian crisis in addition to security crisis. And I also wanted to see, as I understand, they have this post-release services, but I hear from some people on the ground that actually sponsor can deny the services. Is that correct? Have you heard that?
Yes, Congressman, that's absolutely correct, and that actually is what contributed to the Marion, Ohio situation, is that a call was made, and then the case was just simply closed. So today, post-release services is absolutely not enforceable, and it would also mean that you have a case manager who's trained enough to know to even activate the post-release services. So just because there's post-release services, it's not required, it is not mandatory, and the sponsor can say, thank you very much, do not call me again, bye, because there is no authority that HHS has or Office of Refugee Resettlement has to hold the sponsor accountable. And this is what's most baffling. It is a simple fix. The sponsor needs to be held accountable. Why is this a difficult thing? I do not understand. It's the simple fix. Sponsors are accountable. Sponsors are accountable to put the children in school. The sponsor should be accountable to take the child to the immigration hearing. That is what the sponsor signs up for, but that is not what the sponsor is held accountable for. And there's no legal mechanism to make them accountable. And if that changed, then children would not be trafficked.
Well, I appreciate for doing the hearing, and Mr. Chairman, hopefully we will actually be able to, as the discussion, these questions from the administration, ORI, and HSS has to respond to us, because this is inhumane, this is irresponsible, and it only benefits cartels that making a lot of money on desperate people that come from very poor conditions, and American government shouldn't be subsidizing, otherwise we're hypocrites when we criticize other countries for doing things like that. I think this should not be a partisan issue. I appreciate you being here today, and I hope we can actually find solutions to stand with these children and stop this incentivizes this insanity on the border for national security. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Escobar.
Well, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I'd like to express my frustration. I wish this were a real hearing that would result in real solutions and real improvements that would benefit children. But unfortunately, this is not a serious hearing. This is a hearing that's intended to completely distort the record, and really it's strictly for political purposes. But I do agree with my colleague from the gentlelady from Indiana. We do need bipartisan solutions, and we do need a bipartisan effort if we are going to truly address this. So what would that look like? And I think first I'd like to preface my comments by sharing with you all, I represent El Paso, Texas. Fort Bliss, which is in El Paso, is home to one of the largest emergency intake facilities. I have spent a lot of time at the emergency intake facilities. I have spent a lot of time talking to children. I am bilingual, so I speak to the kids in their native language. I have spoken to innumerable staff, former, current staff, and I myself have pushed on the administration at times when I've had to. But what I have found is, unfortunately, here in the House of Representatives, there is an absolute unwillingness by my Republican colleagues to participate in real solutions. So what would some of those solutions look like? Number one, legal pathways. True legal pathways for children to reunify them with their family members would absolutely circumvent the horrific journey that many of them take. But we can't get them to work with us on more legal pathways. Another solution, investing in programs to make sure that there is robust support. We can't get that either. In fact, the president's budget, the amount of funding that he requested was actually ratcheted down by Republican colleagues. And then when we had the omnibus vote, the vote for the budget that would fund HHS and the Department of Homeland Security and a number of other agencies, the chairman voted against it last December. So when you starve a system and you do everything possible to create legal pathways, you're not serious about solving these issues. And in fact, when you call for the reinstatement of horrific policies by the previous administration, including deliberate family separation, you're not interested in solutions that help kids. And last week when we were here trying to create protections for children so that they could have access to legal counsel, or so that they would not be deported, even infants, by themselves, my Republican colleagues all voted against those protections. So let's not pretend this is a serious hearing wanting to truly help children. There is nothing further from that fact. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a fact sheet by HHS, the Administration for Children and Families. One of the witnesses claimed that there is no home study. The fact sheet disputes that, and the facts are that ORR requires a home study for children who are 12 years and under before unification with a non-relative sponsor. May I have unanimous consent to enter this into the record? Every time I visited the emergency intake facility at Fort Bliss and I spoke to kids, their complaint was that the background system was taking too long and that they were not being reunited quickly enough with their families because it was so stringent. Mr. Carey, in the remaining 40 seconds, is there any other misinformation that you'd like to clarify?
Yes, I think it's important to recognize that the ORR vetting system is rigorous. Any system is imperfect, but it is balancing the need of children to be reunited with their families, with their mothers, with their fathers, versus staying in care. And the resources to do so, I believe, should be increased. And I believe there should be more interagency cooperation and clear lines of authority and leadership, such that the lines of communication between ORR and other entities that are coming in touch with these children are perhaps improved.
Thank you for those real solutions. That's what we should focus on, and it should be bipartisan. I yield back.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no other members seeking recognition, that concludes today's hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. And without objection, the hearing is adjourned.